Hi, can everyone hear me? Great. Hi, everybody in the room here today and watching from home. My name is Bonnie Cherner. I am the farm coordinator here at the Stone Barn Center. We are honored to introduce you to Leah Penniman of Soulfire Farm. She is going to be presenting her workshop, Farming While Black. If you have a question during the workshop, I will bring the mic over to you. And you can speak into the microphone so that we can record you properly. For those of you watching remotely, you can ask questions over Facebook Live, and this is going to be a participatory workshop, so we urge you to participate from wherever you're watching. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, appreciate it.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, there are components of this workshop that involve talking to the people at your table. So if you're sitting far away or you're sitting by yourself, I'll pause for a moment so you can readjust and be in community and be close enough that you can enjoy one another's facial expressions and positive energy. So go ahead and make whatever changes you want to make. Thank you. All right, so I'm so excited about this workshop. It's a little bit different than what I've presented in the past. We're going to be focusing on some nerdy stuff, some sciencey stuff, the kind of contributions of Black agrarian experts to what we now know as sustainable or regenerative agriculture, and uncovering some of those stories that often get obscured, appropriated, ignored, or disparaged. And I know that I'm also looking at my interpreters. If you need me to slow down, just give me a hand signal. Okay. Yes, thank you. So we always start by honoring the ancestors. And it's a blessing that we had the prayer at dinner, or at lunch just now. But I also want to give you all an opportunity to think of particular ancestors that have shown up for you, that are with you, that have your back. For me, the ancestor who's often most present, her name is Susie Boyd. She's my grandma's grandma. And she lived in what is now Ghana, West Africa, back in the 1700s, and was watching her family members get kidnapped, get snatched up and sold and forced onto ships. And there was no report back. There was no information about what happened to them. And in the face of that terror, her decision was really beautiful. It was to gather up the seeds of okra, black rice, egusi melon, sorghum, millet, right? And braid those seeds into her hair, believing against odds in a future on soil and believing that she would have descendants who need to inherit the seed, right? So when I'm super discouraged because it's rough out there, I just think, well, if my ancestors didn't give up on me in the face of that oppression, who am I to give up on my descendants? So I invite you in this moment to think of an ancestor who had some foresight for you. And at the count of 3, we're going to call their names loud into the space or type their names in the Facebook. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Ashe. I also understand there was the land acknowledgement done somewhat earlier, but it's very important that we give thanks for the original people of this lands. We are at the crossroads of the Lenape and Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican communities, both of whom were forced off this territory, their territory, in the 1800s. The Mohican folks are on a small reservation in Boulder, Wisconsin, which is swampy and marginal, and very, very far from amenities. I've spent some time there. And they're in a struggle right now because National Grid wants to put a pipeline through some of their ancestors' graves on Pascony Island in the Hudson River. The Lenape are in a struggle right now to save some sacred grounds, the Ramapo community down in Jersey. And so this is not past history, right? And I want to mention that too because it's part of our obligation, I think, as people who are enjoying secular privilege, whether we asked for it or not, to be in solidarity and work together with the original inhabitants. And the last thank you I want to give is to my team, some of whom are here. But, there's this weird hero complex in our society where people think Martin Luther King was a civil rights movement. They think Vandana Shiva came up with ecofeminism, right? And no shade on those two. Their contributions are immense, but it always takes a team. It always takes a team. And so the only way that I can be here telling you stories is because of Letitia and Damaris and Larissa and Amani and all the other folks who are like holding down the broken light bulbs and the sick chickens and all the things, right? So before I talk about Black agrarian practices in general, I want to mention a little bit about Soulfire Farm so that you know why I even care about this stuff. There's a beautiful proverb from the land of my great-great-great-great-grandmother. And it goes like this. It says, latte ete no no da. Can you say that? Latte ete no no da. So it means 3 stones balance the cooking pot. And when we think about projects, we always think about like 3 components to stabilize that project. And so Soulfire Farm has 3 basic things we work on. The first is to actually farm, which I know sounds obvious, but there's like mad Twitter farmers out there who don't actually do farming, but we're on 80 acres. We use regenerative methods that put more carbon in the soil, call the pollinators back, use native seeds, build the topsoil. So we use these regenerative methods and then grow all this bounty of vegetables, meat, medicine, eggs, and that is distributed to our community through what we call solidarity sharing. So this is when food goes for free or low cost to refugees, people impacted by incarceration, folks living in poverty, right in our immediate area. Right? So that's the first stone that holds up our cooking pot. The second stone that holds up our cooking pot is equipping the next generation. I'll tell you, we had our farm open for like 5 minutes before I got a call from 2 states away from somebody saying, like, is it true? There's Black farmers in the woods? Like, can I come? Can I learn? And we realized very quickly that we needed to have educational component. It wasn't enough to just farm, like, each one teach one. And so we started apprenticeships and courses and mentorship, and we now have, I think this year we had 3,000 people in my living room at one point or another learning something. So we also offer a special certificate program in looking fly while hanging onions. You can sign up at soulfirefarm.org. And you too can look this fly while you hang up your alliums. That was a joke. I mean, we do look fly. That part's not a joke. But there's no certificate for that. You just have to practice. And then the third and final stone that holds up our cooking pot is organizing. It's actually mobilizing. It's actually trying to change the system. Because, I mean, it's one thing if we all know how to farm. But where's the land? Where's the capital? Right? Where are the laws that support our rights and dignity as farm laborers? We don't have those in this country. And so we've been working really hard with, through the formal policy making process. We're working with Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders on their platforms. We did a lot of organizing around the last farm bill, kind of boring sounding stuff. But it also involves building institutions that make change too. Like there's a regional land trust called the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust that is accepting reparations, donations of land and redistributing them. So we're helping with that. And then internationally, campaigning with our comrades in Haiti, Vieques, Mexico, Ghana, who are grassroots farmers who are up against, Monsanto and USAID trying to make a life. And so we're offering resources and support in that way too. So that's Soulfire. And the reason why I feel so passionate about Black agrarian wisdom in this context is because Mama Karen kind of mentioned, when I came up learning how to farm and going to all these conferences, I got really disillusioned as a teenager because I thought like I was being a race trader, to be really frank. I'm a smart person, I'm a hardworking person, and I was wondering, would it be better if I lent my intelligence and time to fix the education system, lent my intelligence to dealing with gun violence in our communities, right? Or housing discrimination. And here I am playing in the dirt. What am I doing? And thank God I met Mama Karen back in the day, because she really encouraged me. She was like, you don't even know the whole story of our relationship to lands. And one day, like, we'll have a conference. One day we'll have a book, right? One day we'll have our story. And I love the earth, so I stuck with it. But I don't want another child to have to go through that, to think that the only relationship that their people had to land was being enslaved. I don't want another generation to have to wonder if their people did anything for regenerative agriculture, or if they had a right to own land or a right to produce their own food. Like, of course we do. But unless we have those stories and that history, it feels like a religion to just believe that. There's no facts behind it. So we're going to take a little trip through history, because, my belief is that when my great-great-great-great-grandma was braiding seeds into her hair, she was also braiding wisdom for the journey about what is the good and right way to be in relationship with the earth. What is a good and right way to be in relationship with our food and with each other? And there's a lot of specificity to that we'll get into. But when you're getting your hair braided, there's time taken, right? How long does it take to get a nice style? A day, 4, 8, 10 hours sometimes, depending on what you're getting. And that whole time, there's stories, songs, transmission. And so I believe that in the braiding was also the passage of knowledge about what is our Afro-Indigenous way of being connected to the land, right? So, but before I tell you about that knowledge, I want to kind of poll the room and see what you say. I'm curious. And I'm looking at a couple, you have to be quiet, because I know that this is like your whole life, and I don't want you to give it away. But what Black farming practices do you use on your farm right now? And there's some hints up there. Perhaps you have an African way that you test your soil. Perhaps you have an African way that you financed your farm, an African way that you market your product. But I would love you to take a moment right now, turn to a person next to you, or just the people at your table if you're kind of clumped, or write on Facebook, and answer this question. What do you already do that's Black on your farm? Ready, go. All right, you got about 30 more seconds, and then I'm going to ask for share-outs. Okay. Who is feeling courageous and wants to share one example of an African practice they use on their farm? And I'll repeat it so we don't have to do mics. Yeah. The CSA. Ding, 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 ding. Yes, and I'll explain that. But yes, that is an African agrarian practice. Anyone else? Play the banjo. It's an African American instrument. Beautiful. Yes. And the idea of like music to help your plants grow. One more? You sing to your plants and give them a name. Ashe. Beautiful. All right. So it sounds like y'all are already experts, so we're just going to adjourn. JK. All right. So let's talk about some Black agrarian practices. The most obvious are the crops themselves, right? The seeds that were braided into our ancestors' hair actually became those founder seeds for many important crops. Y'all heard of Coca-Cola before, right? Okay, Coca-Cola is original recipe is made with the cola nuts, right? That came over. It's planted in the Caribbean. Things like melons and gourds, certain varieties of basil, rice, geraniums, coffee, okra, cotton, sesame, the black-eyed pea. Anyone eat black-eyed peas on New Year's for good luck? The black-eyed pea came over, right? Eggplants. The garden egg is the original, but all those varieties originated from that ancestor in Africa. Amara kale and so forth. And then there are many crops that are not from the continent of Africa, but were refined through Black agriculturalists. So if you've ever grown like green glazed collards, it's a variety of collard green that was developed by enslaved Africans. The collard, though, is from Eurasia originally. Things like the Moya Mensing tomato. Tomatoes are from here, Turtle Island, but the Moya Mensing tomato was grown by incarcerated African Americans in Philadelphia and smuggled out of the prison, right? And so there are varieties of crops as well that come from Black agrarian tradition. Soil testing. Has anyone ever done texture by feel where you make those like ribbons and stuff, and then you see how gritty and smooth the soil is, and then maybe it's sandy clay loam, that whole thing? That comes from the Yoruba people. So the Yoruba people classified their soils by texture, and other West Africans had a pH scale that was based on how sour or sweet the soil tasted. Now, I have tried eating a lot of soil, and I have not refined my taste buds to be able to tell pH, but I'm working on it because it can be done. It absolutely can be done. But classifying soils by color, by texture, by productivity, and by taste come from West Africa, and there's quite a bit you can learn from soils without doing a chemical test. We inherited, in my left hand there, we inherited soils back in 2006 that looked like that. The topsoil was basically subsoil, heavy clay, lots of rocks, very eroded. And after 6 years of using Afro-Indigenous farming practices, we were able to get the soil to where it is in my right hand. Rich in organic matter, smells like humates. You know, you can stick your arm in up to your elbow of topsoil. And one of these techniques is compost, which you would think, like, compost has a history? It does. It does have a history. Of course, peoples all around the world have figured out how to recycle crop debris. But the specific idea of encouraging worms to consume detritus and make superfood, like black gold, comes from Egypt. So Cleopatra in 59 BCE put out a decree across the entire empire that said, if you kill a worm, my soldiers will put you to death, which is so intense. And I'm not into capital punishment, so I'm not actually celebrating that particular aspect of the decree, but it is really badass. Like if you kill a worm. And she had a whole cadre of priests whose full-time work was to study earthworms and to figure out how to get them to multiply. And the reason is obvious, right? Their castings are very nutrient rich. And so in 1949, scientists from the USDA went and took soil cores in the Nile River Delta and found that, you know, during that time period, the worm castings were about 10 times what they were in the other time periods because of this sheet composting of the whole area. Really profound. Cradle of civilization, right? Another technique. Has anyone ever heard of like terra preta in the Amazon? Okay. So in West Africa, the version of this super soil is called African dark earth. And it's a combination of charred bones, ash from cooking fires, crop residue, vegetable scraps, certain inoculants from the forest. It's composted, and it makes this super duper black soil. Right? And what's profound about it is that there's a cultural obligation that every single family contribute to the community's layer of earth. So you can go to Ghana and take a soil core, and just like rings on a tree determine the age of the tree, you can look at these layers of dark earth and tell the age of communities, because every single year, families are adding to this amazing, like, dark earth. So these are the techniques that we've been using to advance the soils on our land. What do you think this picture is? I heard slash and burn. I heard forest fire. Anyone else? What if I told you it was crop rotation? So slash and burn, I studied environmental science in school, so probably like many of you, I learned that slash and burn was an ultimate evil visited upon the earth by, ignorant folks who didn't know any better, kind of thing, and that white environmentalists should go teach them how to farm. What I didn't realize is that, quote, slash and burn, the true name of it is Swidden agriculture, and it's a 20 to 30 year crop rotation. Of those 20 to 30 years, the majority of them are in a forest fallow. So the way it works is that you make a clearing in the forest, you burn debris in order to release the nutrients, plant in it for a couple of years until the soil is tired, and then allow it to return to forest. Now, using forest as a cover crop is amazing because those deep-rooted trees, pull up nutrients from layers that annuals can't get at and then deposit them in the leaf layer. They also, those roots, sequester carbon semi-permanently in the earth. So this is a carbon-negative system. Even with the burning, it sequesters much more carbon than it releases. And by the time you get a whole generation later, you're coming back to a healthy forest before you're cutting again. The challenge with the system is when colonizers steal your land. So if they steal your land and your community of indigenous people is forced into a very small area, your rotation can't be 20 or 30 years. Maybe it's 10 or 5 or 3. And then you have the destruction that we see and which is blamed on the indigenous communities because the land was taken. But that idea of cover crop fallow and then cropping and then cover crop fallow comes from the Swidden agriculture systems of sub-Saharan Africa and other indigenous communities as well. Has anyone ever heard of permaculture before? It's a little bit of a four-letter word, I can tell some people are. So permaculture practices are wonderful. The concept of permaculture is challenging for me because it hurts my soul to think of all of these different indigenous farming practices being grouped together under a new brand and then marketed, and that profit not going to the communities who originated that wisdom. So that's why it's a challenging term. But one of the really popular permaculture ideas is perennial polycultures. So when you grow trees together with brambles and bushes and herbs, and then they feed each other. You have like a Siberian pea shrub that's dropping leaves that are rich in nitrogen, and then that's feeding your hazelnut tree. I'm sure you've all heard of this kind of stuff, maybe. In Haiti, that system is called a jardin la cour. Can you say that? Jardin la cour. It means house garden. And I love how simple the name is because it tells you how prevalent the technology is. Everybody has a jardin la cour. Everybody has a moringa tree and a lemon tree intercropped with rosso and vetiver and cactuses and pineapples and herbs all together, feeding itself, right? And this picture is a nursery that we supported the farmers in Léogâne, Haiti, in creating after the earthquake to rejuvenate some of the agroforests that were destroyed in the earthquake and in the chaos that followed. And here we are at Soulfire Farm, building our own jardin la cour. So ours, of course, we can't grow lemon or moringa, so we have apple trees and bee balm and lemon balm and hazelnuts, things like that. But the principles are the same. Does anyone know the name of the bed system that you see in this picture? Does it look like anything? Yeah, terrace, exactly. So terraces co-evolved in what is now like South and Central America, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. In Africa, it's not called a terrace. It's called fanyaju. It's another word that's fun to say if you want to try it. Fanyaju. In Kiswahili, it means throw it upwards, which is, if you think about it, such a brilliant term, because on a hillside, over time, right, the soil like erodes down the hill. And so if you want to build a terrace, you need to dig the soil and throw it upwards behind a barrier and then form these staircases, which prevent further or reduce further erosion. So this is our fanyaju system, which brings into production areas that you can't really access by tractor or that are too unstable to be in annual crops. And that's very important because so many of us from Black and Indigenous communities and other marginalized communities can't necessarily afford and don't have access to these big, flat, riverside farmlands. And we need to figure out, how do we grow food in cities, on slopes, with crappy soil, right? And this fanyaju is one of the ways to bring marginal areas into production. Anyone ever use a hoe before? I hope so. If you're a farmer, you've definitely used a hoe. It's like the most versatile, the most used tool in all of farming in all of the world, because you can use it in dry lands, in wetlands, up slope, down slope. You can dig with it, you can harvest with it, you can weed with it, right? It's the everything tool if you only have one tool. And these Home Depot hoes are not like the original African hoe. The original African hoe is a much bigger, sturdier piece of metal. They're hard to find in the United States. So whenever I go to Ghana or Haiti, I always purchase a bunch of the heads, not the pole part, or not the handle. And I get in quite a bit of trouble with the airline about that, with my oversized sharp metal baggage. But they're treasures. Every year for my birthday, I'm always asked someone to fix up my handle on my hoe or re-handle one of my hoes. Transplanting itself was first documented in West Africa, specifically the transplanting of rice. North and South Carolina made trillions of dollars on the backs of African rice farmers. When people were kidnapped for slavery, they weren't just taken because they were imagined to have strong bodies or something. They were stolen and targeted for their agricultural expertise. It's really cold in Europe. It's really hot in Georgia and Cuba and Brazil. Different things grow there. There's different ways of farming, right? And so specifically, the folks who wanted to grow rice in the wet areas of the Carolinas, they didn't know how to do that. That's not what you do in the UK, right? And so they stole Senegambians, Wolof people, Mende people, to establish the rice fields there in the Carolinas, and to use this brilliant technique that I think we probably all use as farmers of transplanting, the idea of nurturing your little baby seedlings in a controlled environment and then moving them out into the field. So we give thanks to Black farmers for transplanting, and the hoe, and terraces, and compost. And fowl. The oldest domesticated animal historically is the guinea hen, the guinea fowl. Talking about thousands and thousands of years back in East Africa. The chicken did not come from Africa, but it is a relative of the guinea fowl. And Black folks do have a very special relationship with the chicken, though. Not by choice. It's because in Virginia, it was illegal for Black people to own livestock. And in the law, they listed out all different livestock that Black people could not own. Cows, sheep, goats, pigs, turkeys, ducks. These are all listed out. They didn't put chickens. The rationale that we think is that chickens were just considered so insignificant and ubiquitous that why mention them? Black people are not, it was fundamentally to make sure that Black people farmers did not compete with white farmers in the market. And so Black people got really good at raising chickens. A lot of the varieties of birds that we now have were bred by Black farmers under slavery and right after slavery. There's interesting purchasing records from the Jefferson, from like Monticello, of like how many chickens they were purchasing from different Black people and farmers and how many eggs and whatnot. And the idea of rotational confinement also came out of that community. Now many of us use chicken tractors. They look really different back in the day, but this idea of we're going to concentrate the birds over here and then move them over here and move their fertility came out of the Black community. How old do you think that tomato is? Guess? A week. What do you think? 2 years, whoa. You're both partly right. It's 6 months old. It's a 6-month-old, which is very old. I don't know if y'all grow tomatoes, but they tend to deteriorate in quality quite quickly. This tomato is as good as fresh in terms of its eating quality, and it's because it was buried in layers of ash, sifted ash in the ground. Central Africa, and many of the food preservation technologies that we use, such as, if you're into root cellaring, burying your food in sand, ash, or soil, drying methods, salting, fermenting, came out of African indigenous ancestors. There's a lot of more grain fermenting than vegetable fermenting in West Africa. If anyone's ever had like kenke or banku, it's like a fermented corn or millet dish. So we give thanks to Black farmers for helping us out with preserving the harvest. Does anyone grow here in raised beds? Why? Why do you grow in raised beds? Control of? Yep. Helps with weed control. What else do raised beds do? Yep. Warm the soil faster in the spring, control your water, so drainage, especially us with heavy clay soils. If we didn't have raised beds, we couldn't get in there till the middle of May because it's so wet. Any other reasons? Exactly. Yeah, so if the soil's contaminated, putting down landscaping fabric and then building raised beds over the top in order to have like clean soil. Same thing. Yeah, with lead in the soil, arsenic, etc. So the idea of raised beds comes from the Ovambo people in what is now Namibia. You can see this person's raised beds have an addition, which is leaf from the neem tree, and it prevents nematodes from getting into the yams. Right, so there's a little bit of natural pesticide up in there. But we give thanks to the Ovambo people for the raised beds that help us farm where we otherwise couldn't farm. Has anyone ever gone to a work party before? Yes, we definitely rely on them. Once a month, we have 80 to 100 people come to our farm, and we do all the heavy moving of tarps and things that you can't do by yourself, right? So this idea of collective labor co-evolved amongst indigenous people all over the world. But in the Dahomey region of West Africa, it's called Dokpwe. In Haiti, it's called Kombit. And it's a simple idea. It's like, I'm going to your house this weekend, and we're going to plant your beans. Not really, because it's winter, but imagine it's May. And then next weekend, we're going to go to your house and plant your beans. And then the third weekend, we'll go to your house and plant yours. Now your harvest is staggered, so we can come help you with that as well. Whoever is hosting the work party provides the soup and, if it's a particularly challenging task, the brass band. That's the tradition. There is going to be music and singing and celebration and joy while we work together, while we do our communal labor. Imagine how different it would be if that's fundamentally how we organize labor, rather than clocking in and clocking out in timesheets, but through this web of reciprocity. It would kind of change everything, right? So the work party. Does anyone here bank at a credit union? I do. Better than a private bank in many ways. This comes out of West African women who pool their money. They pick the most trusted elder in the community, who they call their susuma, and she's the one who holds the money and counts it and keeps track. But you have a certain amount that you have to deposit every week or month, and then when it's your turn, you can take out a grant or a loan from the group. So if you need to buy a cow, fix the roof on your market stall, buy a uniform for your children to go to school, whatever it is, it's up to you. You have a turn with that resource. And then it's replenished by the community, right? And this became the basis for our concepts of cooperative lending as well as the credit union. And then to what my friend said over here about the banjo and about singing and naming your crops, perhaps the most profound technology is the spiritual technology. When I was living in Ghana, the elders there, they were constantly making fun of Americans because we're super weird, which is fine. But one of the times that I went to go visit them, the Queen Mothers, they said to me, is it true that in the United States, like y'all put seeds in the ground and you don't pray or sing or dance or name the plants or say thank you or anything like to the ground and you expect the seed to grow? It's like, yeah, that's true. Sorry. They said that's why you're all sick, right? You are all sick because you treat the earth like a commodity and not like a relative. So our instructions are we have planting ceremony, we have harvest ceremony, right? You make offerings, you ask permission. Imagine. And it's complicated. I've had to convince other people at my farm. I was like, oh, y'all want to like dig a new area, plant something. Well, we need to ask the Orisha. So we're going to actually take a tool, a divination tool called Obi. It's like a bunch of shells. We're going to throw it on the ground, ask our question, and whatever the answer says is what we're going to do. That is not, we are used to as human beings being the center of the universe. And so if the earth says no to us, for us to actually say, never mind, right, we're going to pause and wait, is challenging. But that's the original covenant that our people believe we have with the earth, is one on consent. Just like we teach our children consent around touching each other, we're supposed to also have consent with the earth before we mess with things. But it's a technology that's been almost forgotten. We just do whatever we want, right? So yeah, we look a little silly, but we're trying to follow the original instructions. Y'all heard of Booker T. Washington, right? Okay. One of the founders of Tuskegee University, Black agricultural college that was built brick by brick by the students and teachers who had like no budget. Really, really profound history if you haven't read about it. But one of the coolest things that they did is they realized that most farmers could not afford to get to the university to learn about these new ideas. And so they said, well, let's bring the university to the people. They started out with a mule and a cart. They would go out into the rural areas, find the most like busted farm in some remote county, and they would do an extreme farm makeover. So they would invite everybody over. They would, fix the animal feed, repair the fences, prune the fruit trees, build terraces, put in cover crops, make the farm like beautiful. They even painted the house, right? They brought nurses to help the children. And then that farm became the model, like the demo site for other farmers to come check out. And they'd move to the next county. Does that remind you of anything? Extension. The first extension agency was Black farmers helping themselves in the 1800s out of Tuskegee University. And now where would we be without extension, right? I call them up all the time. I'm like, my chicken's sick. I don't know what to do. They're like, don't worry, send me a picture. Send me a tissue sample, right? Another Tuskegee mind, of course, is Dr. George Washington Carver. What's he famous for? Peanuts. Made like 1 million or 1,000 peanut inventions. The reason he was so into the peanut is because it's a legume. It is a friend of the bacteria. It makes a home in its roots and fills it with sugar and calls to the bacteria to come and live in that home. And the only thing the legume asks in exchange is that that bacteria inhale nitrogen from the atmosphere, turn it into an organic form, and make it available to all the life in the soil and of the soil, right? And that's why we have nitrogen in the soil. That's why we have crops, is because of these rhizobial bacteria together with the legumes. And so he convinced a whole bunch of farmers in the 1800s to stop planting cotton in certain fields and instead to plant peas and then turn them in as fertilizer. Imagine how crazy that sounded. Like, you want me to stop planting the crop that makes me money and plant something that I'm not going to harvest and just leave it on the ground or turn it into the soil. And he said, oh, that's not the only thing I want you to do. I also want you, when you think you're done for the season in the fall, you're not done. You're going to go to the swamps and drag out the muck from the bottom of the swamps and bring it over and pile it up on your fields. And you're going to go gather the debris from the forest and make piles of it and turn it into compost and spread that on your fields, right? Sound like anything? Organic agriculture started in the 1800s at Tuskegee University. He called it regenerative farming. Not new, right? So Dr. Carver was very much the founder of the modern organic agriculture. This is Rodale, had his heyday in the 1940s. And so this is 2 generations earlier. Another professor at Tuskegee was Booker T. Whatley. Someone mentioned the CSA. Farm to table, pick your own. This is all Whatley. Again, he was way before his time because he's like, forget the whole wholesale thing. Like, don't grow monocrops. Don't sell them to middlemen. You are going to capitalize on the fact that city people miss the country. City people miss the country, and they are going to pay for their longing. You will invite them to harvest on your farm, and they will give you money for the privilege of harvesting pumpkins, apples, strawberries, and raspberries. We're going to call it pick your own, right? And further, you'll create a newsletter so they feel connected. Maybe name your animals. They feel they can participate in that. You give them a discount for being a member. And so this idea of like the CSA, of like agritourism, farm to table, very much came out of Whatley. And he saved a whole generation of farmers from losing their businesses because they finally had a profitable model. He was targeted by the KKK for that also. We mentioned cover crops, so we'll skip that. Land trusts are profound. In West Africa, and also here on Turtle Island, and amongst many indigenous people, the idea of private land ownership just doesn't even make sense. Like, how on earth are you going to take a piece of the planet and put your name on it and say that it's yours, that you're in control, no one else can own it? The struggle has been, how do we take this conception of shared land stewardship and use white man's law to make it work so they don't then take our land away, right? Because when indigenous people got their land taken away, black folks got their land taken away. Shirley and Charles Sherrod were really wrestling with this. They traveled all around the world, including to Israel, to try to look at land tenure ideas, and came up with the community land trust. The land is owned by a nonprofit organization run by a board that's committed to certain principles. But the homes, infrastructure that are built on the land belong to the people who created them, and they can't be kicked out. So they have this equity building, this permanency, but the land is of the people. They got 6,000 acres in Albany, Georgia, with 500 families together for this project. Would you say that the idea of land trust took off? There's land trust everywhere. And they started here, right? They just celebrated their 50th anniversary. It was a rocky road. They were also targeted by the KKK, lost their land, sued, got it back, blah, blah, blah. But they just celebrated their 50th anniversary. Does anyone here participate in a food hub? Or know what a food hub is? What is a food hub? Mm-hmm. Exactly. So farmers consolidating their crop to access a larger market in one place. When these first started, they were called church sheds. Any idea why? They were sheds behind the church. Black churches in the South would gather up the produce from the farmers, sweet potatoes and melons especially, and sell them to the congregation. And if they had extra, they usually had a sister congregation along the lines of the underground of the Great Migration that they would then ship, a truckload of watermelons up to and sell them out of that church. And so this was the beginning of the idea of food hubs. Dorothy and Philip Barker were among the very first farmers that created a food hub called Spring Plant, Mississippi, Operation Spring Plant. They were awarded a commendation a couple years ago at the Black Farmers Conference for their role in kicking off the food hub movement. So we give thanks for that. And then the last example I'll give for now, because there are many, many more, is perhaps my favorite because it's very personal. When I was living in Worcester, Massachusetts, and doing urban farming, I became pregnant. I gave birth to a wonderful child. Her name is Nashima. And, the kind of parent I am, she came along and helped with the farm and, stayed on my back or sat in the soil while I planted. And so I took Nashima to her 1 year, physical checkup, and the child has lead poisoning. There's no lead in the home, right? She had gotten lead poisoning from the earth because when buildings were demolished in Worcester, there wasn't proper cleanup, and so lead paint was just mixed in with the soil. And I'm an activist, right? And so it wasn't enough for me to figure out how to chelate my child and get her well. I was like, what about all these other thousands and thousands of children in this community? So went around and started soil testing. Now, the Environmental Protection Agency sets the safe limit for soil lead at 400 ppms, which is still pretty high. We found soil lead as high as 11,000 parts per million, which is super fun, super toxic. And this is in community gardens, playgrounds, schoolyards, all around the city. Well, this little flower came with us in our ancestors' braids. It's called the Pelargonium or scented geranium. There's some growing in the greenhouse here. I was rubbing on myself. This flower that came with us has been a true ally because it has a superpower called hyperaccumulation, where it is really good at sucking heavy metals out of the soil and putting it into its leaves. So we got together, a bunch of teenagers, those are real hazmat suits, got the city to pay them. They're called the Toxic Soilbusters, their business, to use pelargonium to remediate areas that had moderate levels of lead, and then also to do the landscaping fabric, complete barrier for areas where the lead was really high and cleaned up the whole city. So it's an awesome flower. We give thanks to West African farmers for developing that variety. So my question for you all is if Black farmers have always been so badass, how come this conference isn't mostly Black? How come most of the farmers all around the country are not Black? What is actually preventing the flourishing of these profound ideas into the present? So I'm going to ask you to turn and talk again with people at your table and answer this question. What do you think is preventing the flourishing?
Can you just make sure you repeat it because they don't
Yeah.
have mics so we can hear it?
Yeah, will do. Thank you. All right, about 30 more seconds. All right, we're going to bring it back together. And it looks like we have a mic close by. Does anyone want to share what they came up with? Inequality. Do you want to say more about what's unequal? Mm-hmm. Access to education, lending money, access to property are examples of inequality. Good. What else? Yeah. Yeah. Countless examples of inequality. Redlining is another one, which I'll explain in a minute too, for those who haven't heard of it. What else? Trauma. Talk about it. Mm-hmm. There is not one Black child who arrives at our farm who does not immediately make an audible association with slavery as their first thought when it comes to land or farming. That's profound. Children, right? That's what's been inherited. So yes, there's a lot of trauma.
So I'm Canadian, and I would say that in Canada, a lot of Black agricultural knowledge is held by migrant laborers who come from the Caribbean. And there's no pathway for migrant labor in Canada to go on to get Canadian citizenship. And therefore, there's no ability to own land and thus encourage the flourishing of Black agrarianism.
Ashe, yep.
I just want to name a lot of people in the room now, but there's historical trauma, but also the ongoing theft of land. That's through the legal system, through the USDA, FSA, intimidation, and continuing loss of land by Black farm owners.
Yep, thank you. One more example?
I think I'd like the reclaiming of spaces like this by white people in general. This one? Yep.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Like who's taking up space and who's centered. So I'm going to talk about 5 barriers that I see, which you've already mentioned, some of them. One is that this entire food system is built on stolen land, and that is not just historical, that continues into the present. I think we're all aware that we are on land that was taken through the attempted genocide of Indigenous people. And then it was stolen again, first by preventing Black and brown folks from owning land through Alien Land Acts and Naturalization Acts. But then also, even when Black people did manage to purchase 16 million acres of land in 1910, not because of reparations, there was no 40 acres and a mule, but by saving money for 2 generations, almost all that land is gone. And there were 3 main things that happened that caused people to lose their land. The first, and most blatant, was that the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council and the White Caps, they're 3 terrorist organizations, organized to force Black people off their land through violence. And so people's homes were burned. They were shot at, they were strung up, lynched, and those folks' property, after they were killed or driven off, was just taken by white neighbors. The Associated Press did a whole story on this a couple of years ago, documenting several hundred of these thousands of cases. That is what fueled the Great Migration. That's what caused 6 million people to run and get away from the South. Because if you tried to make anything of yourself other than a sharecropper, you would be facing extrajudicial killing, right? The second major thing that caused Black land loss was the federal government itself. The USDA did not give loans, crop insurance, technical assistance, or crop allotments to Black farmers at anywhere near the same rates as white farmers. That money's controlled at the county level. You have an overtly racist county, then you have overtly racist disbursement of funds. And USDA funds were used as a tool to punish civil rights activity in the 1960s, right? And so you had, if you registered to vote or joined the NAACP, then your application should be ripped up in your face. Pete Daniels' book, Dispossession, talks about this. This is what led to black farmers filing a class action lawsuit against the federal government, which was settled in 1999, the Pigford case. It's the largest civil rights settlement in favor of oppressed people in the history of this country. But by then, most of the farmers were in their 80s and 90s. And with a typical payout of $50,000, barely get a tractor, definitely can't get your farm back, right? The third thing, which you were talking about, is this heir property exploitation. You know, the way land is handed down in black communities is through the family. The idea of a will is not an African concept. And access to lawyers to write a will is not within the means of most black farmers. So you have about half of our land in unclean deeds, like heir property. And it's very, very easy in most states. If a developer convinces one heir to sell their land, their share, it forces sale of the entire property, right? And so this is something that we're dealing with right now today. And it's why, see that graph in the top right? That's land ownership, farmland ownership 2017 by race. The green is white landowners. Over 98% of the farmland in this country is owned by white farmers. That is worse than it's ever been in the history of this country. So while in a lot of ways we think about being on this progressive march towards justice, our rhetoric may be, and some of our laws may be, but when you look at who owns the land and who owns the wealth, it's getting more racially skewed over time, right? So that's the first. The second big thing that you mentioned so beautifully is labor. You know, farm workers who are black and brown do the lion's share of the labor on farms. 85% of farm workers here in the United States are Latinx, Latino, or Latina. And only 2.5% of those folks actually manage the farms. If you look at Department of Labor statistics, farming, meaning owning, you know, the USDA says when you're like managing the farm, you're a farmer, right? That's the whitest profession. When you look at farm labor and food system labor, that's the brownest profession. So it's a very racially imbalanced industry. And there are not pathways for folks who are farm employees to become farm owners and citizens, right? And our labor laws do not offer equal protection for those folks. You know, the Fair Labor Standards Act excludes farm workers. There is no right to overtime pay. There's no minimum wage federally on small farms at all. There is none. Child labor protections are very lax, right? No right to a day off in 7, no right to unionize. And that's baked in, those racist policies are baked into our federal labor law. The third reason is that on the other side of the food system, we actually don't have access to these life-giving, ancestrally, culturally appropriate foods, right? Because of redlining, which is a form of housing discrimination sanctioned by the federal government, black and brown people are forced into very specific neighborhoods where banks will not lend, so you can't get a mortgage, can't own a house, and where zoning restrictions prevent folks from moving to other neighborhoods. This wasn't outlawed until 1977, and even since it's been outlawed, studies show when they send in like 2 actors, one's black and one's white with the same paperwork, and they try to buy a home or they try to rent a home, that housing discrimination has not improved since it was outlawed in 1977. So you still have extremely segregated cities, and your zip code in 2019 is the #1 predictor of your life expectancy. Your zip code, right? Because that determines what you're breathing in, what toxins, what kind of education you have access to, what kind of food you have access to, right? Whether the police are harassing you and beating you down and putting you in jail is determined by your zip code, which is in turn, by and large, determined by your race in this country. So there's a few things against the black farmer, right? Another thing is, of course, the way we treat the humans is also the way we treat the planet right now with industrial agriculture causing climate change, pollinator destruction, dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. And this beautiful knowledge of the seed braids that could be harnessed to heal our relationship with the earth instead is either ignored or at best appropriated and stolen. And that's very demoralizing for a people to say, like, I've given forth the gift of this seed, right? but to have the person erased from that gift if it's even seen at all. And then the fifth and final thing I think we're up against is trauma, both historical and present. You know, as my comrade Chris Bolden Newsom said, the land was the scene of the crime. Like, the land is where the sharecropping, the lynching, the slavery took place. And I think the challenge is, though, that the land was actually never the criminal. The land is what sustained us. The land is what made it possible for us to carry forward. But we have a lot of healing to do. We have a lot of reaching back across 500 years of oppression to the stories of the Ovambo people and Cleopatra and our relationship with the guinea fowl to be able to rewrite a healthy narrative in relationship to the land. But the good news is, you know, every time folks come out to the farm and get connected to the earth, get their bare feet on the earth, that healing happens like automatically. Like our ancestors in the earth have just been waiting for us to come home and then start to take care of that for us. Would someone be willing to read this quotation into a mic?
The white man, preoccupied with the abstractions of the economic exploitation and ownership of the land, necessarily has lived on the country as a destructive force, an ecological catastrophe, because he assigned the hand labor, and in that the possibility of intimate knowledge of the land, to a people he considered racially inferior. In thus debasing labor, he destroyed the possibility of a meaningful contact with the earth. He was literally blinded by his presuppositions and prejudices. Because he did not know the land, it was inevitable that he would squander its natural bounty, deplete its richness, corrupt and pollute it, or destroy it altogether. The history of the white man's use of the earth in America is a scandal. Wendell Berry.
I mean, this speaks for itself, but something that's so profound for me about it is the way it elegantly and clearly knits together the oppression of human beings and the oppression of the earth as a single struggle. I think one of the big challenges we face is that, you know, you come to an organization like Stone Barns, let's be real, or like many of these other organizations, they're like, oh, well, we don't do social issues, right? We do the earth, like we do farming, we do production. It is not actually possible in good conscience to separate out the way we treat humanity, the way we treat our siblings, and the way we treat the earth. It's one struggle, right? It's absolutely one struggle. Which brings us to this last question that I'm going to ask you, and then I'll tell you my answer to it, but it's the last time I'm going to ask you a question, which is, what do you think we can do to show some respect for this Black agrarian tradition, to carry on the legacy of our ancestors who braided seeds, knowledge, and wisdom into their hair? So I won't make you turn and talk. Does anyone want to just speak to it? Just raise your hand. What do you think?
Teaching that education into our curriculum and making sure that it's, I just said education, teaching it into the curriculum, making sure that it's part of what kids are learning for generations, and to continue to integrate it.
Thank you. Well, there's a
cool.
Facebook audience, I guess.
Okay. Like implement like traditional farming practice that you just mentioned into our own farms, or whoever is farming as well, as well as it being an educational aspect if you can make it be on your own farm.
Have you all, I love that. And have you all heard of the Segurite Land Trust in Cali? Okay, so a lot of things I love about what they do, but one of the things is the tax, right? So a lot of folks are living on their land, right? And yes, how do you pronounce it? The Shumi land tax. So this is something to look up. So a lot of people are living on their land, and meanwhile, they're paying taxes to the colonial government, right? And they are paying rent to landlords who are not from the indigenous community. So people are encouraged to take a portion of that and pay a tax to the indigenous communities for the privilege of living on the land. And I think this comes into play when we talk about using farming practices or cultural practices from communities that we're not a part of, right? And so if we are going to, like, imagine a world where every time you use some cover crops, right, you are going to give money over to the Black community, to Tuskegee, to Dr. Carver's family for the privilege of using that technology, which was never actually paid for, right? I know we don't have the infrastructure to make that easy, but it's a concept I want us to think about because appropriation has become so commonplace that folks are like, you know, I took a yoga class, now I can just, it's mine and I can share it and like charge people money and things, but you know, it's not fun, it's not mine, so I'm not gonna be profiting off of it. It's just something to think about. One more example?
I think your presentation, and especially that one chart of 98.5% of land being owned by white folks, and just the downward slope of Black land ownership, and the fact that this is stolen land that we're all on, leads us back to the question, I think a real fundamental question of what would reparation look like, and does the model of this sort of, you know, Western model of land ownership that we have, that you mentioned in your presentation of, I bought this land, so this is mine until I decide to sell it or pass it on. I think bringing that into question and figuring out new models and really getting down to the question of what would reparation, truth and reconciliation look like. And I think there's no more fundamental issue than farmland. So I don't know the answer, but I think that is really the question.
Snaps to that, absolutely. And that's a perfect transition because I would say, like, if there's one thing that we all can do, right, is to think about reparations and what I'm hearing now called micro reparations, because to do reparations on a societal scale involves an act of Congress and should. But in the meantime, there are ways to think about how can I give land, how can I give resources, how can I give support to organizations that are led by the people most impacted by the issues. So to Black and brown farmers in this case, right? Educate myself, tell the truth, and then figure out how to transfer resources and power over. And Mama Karen Washington talks about this so well. Whenever people come up with ideas about how to help, she's like, what resources are moving and what power is moving? Because if no resources is moving and no power is moving, that is not a solution. Like, the only answer is to take the stolen stuff and give back at least a bit of it for now, and then eventually we got to give it all back, right? We did take the time, because a lot of people want to help, which is beautiful. So we interviewed over 500 Black and brown farmers across the country about what they need and created a what you can do guide. So we're not going to get into all that right now, but if you want to go to soulfirefarm.org/take action, there's a what you can do guide that has something for everyone. So you definitely check it out. And again, to super emphasize that Black and brown folks are already doing the work, usually with no salaries, busted looking website, like no one managing their social media, right? I want to close with an exercise, and then we have a couple minutes for questions. That's a call and response. So we're going to shout out some of these projects. I'm going to say, I have a shout, and you all say out in unison. So I have a shout out for the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance, and then together we say, may your strength be strengthened. So may your strength be strengthened. I have a shout out for the National Black Food and Justice Alliance. May your strength be strengthened. I have a shout out for SAFON. Strengthened. I have a shout for Familias Unidas por la Justicia. May your strength be strengthened. I have a shout for Via Campesina. May your strength be strengthened. I have a shout for the Indigenous Youth Council. May your strength be strengthened. I have a shout for Bugs. May your strength be strengthened. I have a shout for the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. May your strength be strengthened. I have a shout for the Black Belt Justice Center. May your strength be strengthened. I have a shout for the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. May your strength be strengthened. I have a shout for the Heal Food Alliance. May your strength be strengthened. I have a shout for the Native Land Conservancy. May your strength be strengthened. I have a shout for all of you. Thanks, everyone. Okay. We have 4.5 minutes for questions. If anyone has question, comment, concern. Yeah.
Wow, that was so fast. I just want to thank you for the space and for producing this book as well. It was really, really transformative, and yeah, thank you for that. And I wanted to ask you specifically about your CSA model and sort of the process that you went through in doing the tiered system for folks who pay more and folks who pay like a little bit less. What were the conversations that you had specifically with trying to get people to pay more, or trying to get people to understand why it is they were paying more? Yeah, I'd see that as a model that I'd like to follow, and I'm just wondering how those conversations happen for you.
Word. In full disclosure, we're switching our model, not because it's bad, it's for other reasons, but just wanted to say that. But for folks who don't know, we do have a doorstep delivery farm share. There's 110 households that are involved, and it's sliding scale. So we reserve a certain number of shares for people who pay below market, and then a certain number of people who pay above, so the farmer still gets paid, and it's doorstep, all that. We actually have a waiting list for people who want to pay more. I think, at least in our community, which is not a very progressive community, there are enough people who want to make a difference and want an easy way to make a difference and don't have the direction. And so providing folks with an opportunity to just kick in like an extra, it's not a lot, but like $25 or $50 a month on their grocery bill is going to allow a new American, a refugee, to get affordable vegetables. That's a very appealing concept. So, I mean, I don't like to think of the idea of marketing a social justice mission, but I mean, fundamentally, for a capitalist framework, it's what it is. It's like you're putting out, like, you too can feel good about yourself by doing this thing. I would say the pushback we got is we don't deliver in those neighborhoods, wealthy neighborhoods. People have to come to the low-income neighborhoods to get their food, and we've gotten some pushback, like, you drive right through my neighborhood to get there. And we're like, no, we actually think it's an important part of your education to have to go pick up your food where everybody else lives and deal with it. So, yeah.
I'm wondering if you can talk about your business. I know you in your book you say you're switching into a more cooperative model. So what was the decision making behind that, and why did you decide?
We now have so we did it. We have two entities on the farm. So the land is owned by a housing co-op, and the vision there. There's many visions, but we did want the capacity to have like a residential sort of co-housing situation that was not just employees of the farm. So the farm is run by a nonprofit organization, 501c3, that's a member tenant of the co-op, but then residents are also member tenants of the co-op. One of the things about this new co-op, well, two things we really like. One is we wanted to make sure that everybody who lived there, regardless of whether they bought a share, had decision making. So we're using what's called like a manager-managed LLC model, which separates out the people who pay and it still allows people who don't pay to have like a seat on the management committee. It's a little technical, but it was important for us that if someone is like an intern on the farm, that they still have a say in land use decisions. And the second thing we incorporated is rights of nature. And so we looked at New Zealand and Ojibwe precedent, and we have a process where on an annual basis, the land has to approve all of the plans of the co-op, which was like a fun legal digging to find like the right language that was allowed to do that. So, yeah. Take two more questions. Yeah.
If we live somewhat local, how do we, I'm sure it's on your website, but do you have like, how can I help? How can we help?
Well, we have monthly community volunteer days from April to November. Those are super fun. Everyone's welcome. And we also need $1 million to build a program center. So, yeah, because we're not up to code, the county's finally paying attention, which is not a great thing. And also, we've been running all these programs out of our family home, and 10 years is a long time to do that. So, yeah, if anyone has $1 million or knows someone, in all seriousness, like, introduce us. We don't know a lot of rich people, so it's a good cause. It's going to be like another super straw bale, cool building. They can put their name on it, whatever. It'd be cool.
I know some rich people, but other than that,
awesome.
One more thing real quick. But as far as like agricultural help during the winter, I know you do things in the winter.
Oh, winter is mostly education and organizing for us. It's a lot of this kind of stuff.
Not a lot of growing.
We don't do like winter greens or anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, one more question.
Thank you. I also want to say thank you so much for your presentation and all the work that you've done. And you've educated myself, and I know a lot of my peers a lot, and I was just wondering what your view is on nonprofits that benefit from that status, and also maybe money from the government in educating apprentices and their role, and honestly their obligation in teaching this history that nobody knows about. And do you think that that would help in any way to educate the public and maybe spur more reparations?
Thank you for that. I mean, it sounds like you kind of answered your own question. I mean, I think anyone who eats food and lives on land has an obligation to work on these things, and it's going to look different for each of us, which is one of the reasons we made that guide is, you know, if some people don't have access to land and money, so that's not what they can do, but they do have an educational platform so they can shift the narrative. They do have an educational platform so they can shift the narrative. And so for a farmer, I think we have the opportunity to think about how we make sure that our product doesn't just go to elite customers. Like, how do we think about democratizing access to the things we grow, even a portion of it? Yeah, so I appreciate that you're thinking about that. I'm very grateful. All right, so there's evals going around for y'all to fill out. I have a couple of books right here in case anyone would like to purchase one or chat. And I think there's more in the bookstore, so I'll kind of migrate down there afterwards. But thank you, everyone, so much.